The human fleet was busy, preparing for one of the biggest battles in the war against the Xenthar Empire. Ships lined up in orbit, and soldiers moved quickly across the deck. Among them was Captain Caden Holt, a man who had seen too many battles, too many faces lost in the chaos. He was no longer the young soldier he once was. His years in war had hardened him, turned him into a shadow of the man he used to be. But then something caught his attention. A signal came through the comm system, faint at first, like a whisper lost in the noise of space. It was a distress call, a garbled transmission that was hard to make sense of, but there was something familiar about it. Holt leaned forward, adjusting the controls. He had heard that voice before. "Help, help me, Captain Holt." His heart stopped. He remembered that voice. It was Kuril. Years ago, on a forgotten planet, he had saved her life. A young alien girl, scared and alone, trapped in a world at war. Holt had been part of a rescue team that found her after the Xenthar had attacked her village. She had been just a child, desperate to survive. She had reminded him of the humanity he had fought to protect. He had promised to keep her safe. But after that, he never saw her again. The mission was over, and the war kept moving forward. Holt moved from one battle to the next, trying to forget the girl he had saved. But now her voice was calling him back. "Kuril," he whispered, barely able to believe what he was hearing. The transmission was weak, the words scrambled, but one thing was clear: she was in trouble. And if there was one thing Holt couldn't ignore, it was a call for help from someone he had sworn to protect. He didn't hesitate. He immediately contacted his commanding officer, explaining the situation. The officer was reluctant. Holt was needed for the final push against the Xenthar. But Holt wasn't listening. He had made a promise once, and he intended to keep it. Within minutes, Holt was in a fighter ship, heading toward the coordinates of the transmission. The stars stretched out before him as the ship broke through the atmosphere of a distant planet. His mind raced, thinking about what Kuril might have been through all these years. She had been just a child the last time he saw her. How much had changed? What had happened to her since? As Holt descended toward the planet's surface, the comms crackled again. It was Kuril's voice, this time clearer, but filled with fear. "Captain Holt, they're coming. Please, hurry." His grip tightened on the controls. He didn't know what was waiting for him on the surface, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let her down again. Captain Caden Holt's heart raced as his fighter ship cut through the clouds of the planet below. The landscape below was a war zone. Ruins of buildings, dark smoke rising from burning structures, and the constant sound of distant explosions. It was clear this planet had been under constant attack. There was no sign of life, just the aftermath of years of destruction. The distress signal had led him here, but Kuril's message was a mystery. "They're coming." Who was she talking about? The Xenthar, or someone else? Holt's thoughts raced. He had to focus. Time was running out, and he couldn't afford to waste a second. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was the only person who could help Kuril. He remembered the young girl from years ago, so full of fear, yet so strong for her age. She had barely spoken when he rescued her, but her eyes told the story. Eyes full of loss, but also of hope. Holt hadn't forgotten them, not for a moment. As he neared the surface, he spotted a small rebel camp. It was hidden in the remains of a shattered city, the kind of place where survivors tried to make a last stand against the enemy. Holt's fighter touched down carefully, the dust swirling around as he opened the hatch and stepped onto the rocky ground. He was greeted by a couple of soldiers, their faces tired and wary. They didn't know him, but they knew why he was there. "You're here for the girl?" one of them asked. Holt nodded. "Where is she?" "She's inside, but I wouldn't go in there if I were you," the soldier warned. "The Xenthar have been hunting her, and it's not just the Xenthar we're worried about." Holt's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" The soldier hesitated. "There are whispers of a traitor, someone working with the Xenthar. If you're not careful, You might walk right into a trap. That was all Holt needed to hear. A traitor. Someone who could be working against Carol, and possibly against him as well. But he couldn't turn back now. He had promised her once, and he wasn't about to break that promise. Not after everything they had been through. Without another word, he made his way into the rebel camp, the soldiers parting to let him pass. The camp was dark, with only the glow of dim lanterns lighting the way. Inside, Holt found Carol sitting on a bench, her head lowered. She was older now, her face hardened by the years of war. But there was something in her eyes that made Holt stop in his tracks. Her eyes, those same eyes he remembered from the past, were looking at him with a mixture of surprise and fear. "Carol," Holt said softly. She looked up, recognition flashing in her eyes. But there was no smile, no warm greeting. Instead, her face went pale, and her voice cracked. "You came. I didn't think anyone would come." Holt knelt beside her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "I promised I'd protect you. I haven't forgotten." Carol's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, not wanting to show weakness. "I didn't ask for your help," she whispered. "I don't want to be anyone's burden." "You're not a burden," Holt said firmly. "We're in this together." But before he could say more, the sound of footsteps echoed from outside the camp. Carol's eyes widened in fear. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Holt's hand went to the sidearm at his hip. It was time to fight. The real battle was about to begin. The moment the footsteps stopped outside the camp, Holt's instincts kicked into high gear. He quickly scanned the area, eyes darting around the camp's perimeter. It was silent for a moment, but the tension was palpable. Holt could feel the weight of Carol's fear beside him. He didn't need to ask her what was coming. He already knew. "They found us," Carol whispered, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay strong. Holt gripped his sidearm tightly and looked at the soldiers around them. They were too few to defend against a full HFY assault. There was no time to wait. He needed to get Carol out of here. "Now. Move out," Holt ordered, his voice low but commanding. "Get to the transport. I'll cover you." The soldiers nodded quickly, their faces set with determination. They were used to fighting, but they all knew that the Synthar were not an enemy you could face head-on unless you had the numbers. They had to keep moving, keep surviving. Carol stood up, but before she could take a step, Holt placed a hand on her arm. She looked at him, her expression confused. "I'm not leaving you behind," he said, his tone firm. "We get out of here together. Understand?" Carol swallowed hard and nodded. For the first time since Holt had arrived, she allowed herself to trust him completely. She knew what the Synthar were capable of. They had hunted her for years, never giving up. But Holt was different. He wasn't just a soldier to her. He was the one person who had promised to protect her, and he had kept that promise once. She wasn't going to let fear stop her from believing in him again. They moved quickly, slipping through the camp toward the escape route. But just as they were about to make it to the transport, a loud explosion shook the ground beneath them. Dust and debris rained down as the Synthar's forces made their presence known. The camp was under attack. "Go! Go!" Holt shouted, pushing Carol toward the transport. He turned, taking cover behind a fallen structure as blaster fire rained down from the trees. The Synthar soldiers were fast, and they didn't miss. Holt's pulse quickened, but his training kicked in. He returned fire, his shots finding their targets as the Synthar fell one by one. But for every one he took down, two more appeared. Carol's breath was ragged behind him as she scrambled into the transport. Holt followed, keeping his gun raised, never letting his guard down. He jumped into the cockpit, slammed the door shut, and punched in the coordinates. The transport shot into the sky, narrowly escaping the Synthar's weapons fire. As they climbed higher, the ship's engines roaring, Holt turned to Carol. Her face was pale, but her eyes were filled with gratitude and something more, a kind of fierce determination that reminded him of the girl she once was. She wasn't just the one who needed saving anymore. She had grown strong, capable, and she was ready to fight back. "They won't stop," Carol said, her voice steady now, though a hint of worry still lingered. "They'll keep coming for me." Holt's jaw tightened. "Then we'll make them regret it," he said with quiet confidence. "This time, they'll have to answer to us." The Xinthar had no idea what they were about to face. The transport soared through the dark sky, its engines humming steadily as it left the burning wreckage of the rebel camp behind. Holt didn't take his eyes off the controls, his fingers moving swiftly over the buttons and switches. But his mind was racing with thoughts of Carell. The fight was far from over, and the Xinthar were relentless, but Holt had a bigger concern now. Who could they trust? Carell sat in the seat beside him, her face pale but determined. She looked out the window at the passing stars, lost in thought. Holt could see the weight of years of running and hiding in her eyes. She had been alone for so long, forced to keep her distance from anyone who might want to use her. The artifact she carried had made her a target. And now, after all this time, she was back in the fight. Holt finally spoke, his voice low. "Carell, we can't keep running forever. We need help. But the question is, who can we trust?" Carell didn't answer right away. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Trust," she repeated quietly, as if the word was foreign to her. "I haven't trusted anyone in years, Holt. Not after what happened last time." Holt frowned, a knot forming in his stomach. He knew she was talking about the betrayal. The same betrayal that had shattered the rebellion and left Carell vulnerable to the Xinthar. Someone close to their group had turned on them, feeding information to the enemy. It had almost cost Carell her life. Holt remembered the pain in her eyes when she spoke of it, the trust she had placed in the wrong people. "I understand," Holt said, his voice softening. "But I'm not like them, Carell. You don't have to carry this alone anymore." For a moment, Carell's face softened. She looked at him, and for the first time, Holt saw the girl she had once been, the girl who had trusted him with her life. But that girl was buried deep beneath years of pain and survival. Carell had changed, just as much as Holt had, and trust was no easy thing for either of them. The silence between them was interrupted by the sudden crackle of the ship's comm system. Holt stiffened, reaching for the controls. "Captain Holt," a voice came through the static. "This is Commander Jensen. We've intercepted a signal from a nearby colony. They claim to have information on Carell's whereabouts and the artifact." Holt's eyes narrowed. A colony? He knew there were small resistance cells scattered throughout the galaxy, but he hadn't heard anything about this one. It could be an ally, or it could be another trap. "Do we know who they are?" Holt asked, keeping his voice calm. "Negative, sir, but they're offering help," Commander Jensen replied. "They've been tracking Xinthar movements in the area, and they seem to know about the artifact." Carell tensed beside Holt, her hand tightening around the edge of her seat. "The artifact. They know about it," she whispered. Holt glanced at her, then back at the controls. His gut told him something wasn't right. He could feel it. The Xinthar weren't the only ones interested in the artifact. There were others, human and alien factions, that would do anything to get their hands on its power. "Set a course," Holt said, his voice steady. "We'll meet them, but we keep our guard up. No one's getting close to that artifact unless we say so." As the ship turned toward the colony's coordinates, Holt couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. But he wasn't about to let Carell face whatever was waiting for them alone. He glanced at her again. "You ready for this?" Carell met his gaze, her eyes sharp and focused. "I don't have a choice." With that, they prepared for whatever lay ahead, knowing that trust would be as dangerous as it was necessary. The transport flew silently through the dark expanse of space, the distant stars twinkling like tiny beacons in the vast unknown. Holt and Carell sat side by side, neither saying much. The tension between them was thick. The colony ahead could be their salvation or their doom, but there was no turning back now. As they neared the colony, Holt's mind was racing. He had heard of many resistance groups in the galaxy, some of them well-meaning, others less so. But something about this particular group felt off. The way they had known about the artifact, it wasn't something that would be easily shared. And Kirill's reaction had only confirmed his suspicions. She was on edge, and Holt couldn't blame her. "I don't like this," Kirill said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed her unease. "I've been to too many places like this. Too many promises." Holt nodded. "I feel the same way. But we don't have much of a choice. We'll stay alert." The transport entered the colony's orbit, a small but well-established settlement on the moon of a nearby gas giant. The colony was a cluster of buildings that seemed to be cobbled together from various scraps of technology, looking both makeshift and functional. There were no grand structures, no signs of wealth, but the lights were on, and that was enough to signal that it was still alive. The landing zone was just outside the main settlement. Holt brought the ship down smoothly, the engines whirring as they touched the surface. He turned to Kirill, giving her a serious look. "Stay close," he said. "We don't know who we're dealing with yet." Kirill nodded without speaking. She had learned the hard way that trust was a rare commodity in a galaxy at war. They disembarked, stepping onto the dusty ground. The air was thin and cold, the sky a deep shade of purple, lit by the gas giant looming in the distance. There were a few people milling around, some soldiers, others civilians, but all of them looked at Holt and Kirill with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. A tall man with graying hair and a scar across his cheek approached them. His uniform was patched, like everything else here, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. "You must be Captain Holt," the man said, his voice gruff. "We've been expecting you." Holt studied the man for a moment before nodding. "And you are?" "Commander Alaric," the man replied. "I'm in charge here. We know you're looking for information on the artifact, and we have it." Kirill stiffened at the mention of the artifact, her eyes narrowing. Holt noticed it but didn't comment. He didn't trust anyone who knew too much about it. "What do you know?" Holt asked, keeping his voice even. Alaric motioned for them to follow him, leading them toward a small building in the center of the colony. The walls were covered with old maps and star charts, some of them marked with Synthar movements. It was clear that the colony had been monitoring the war for a long time, and they were ready to fight back. "Come inside," Alaric said, pushing open the door. "I'll show you." They entered a dimly lit room where several people were gathered around a holographic display. The moment they stepped inside, the group turned to face them. There was a young woman with dark hair and a serious expression, a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days, and an older scientist with glasses who didn't seem to notice their arrival. "We've been tracking the Synthar for years," Alaric began, "and we found something that can change the course of the war." Kirill's eyes flickered toward Holt, but she didn't speak. She had heard enough of these promises to know that words didn't mean much. Holt could see the doubt in her eyes, and he shared it. Alaric continued, "The artifact is more than just a weapon. It's a key to something much bigger. And it's what the Synthar have been after all this time." Holt exchanged a glance with Kirill. They were both on edge now, the tension growing thicker. What was this man really offering them? "So what's the catch?" Holt asked, his voice hardening. Alaric smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "There's always a catch, Captain, but this one's simple. Help us, and we'll help you. The Synthar are closing in. If we don't act fast, the artifact, and everything it leads to, will be lost." Kirill stood silently, her fists clenched. Holt could see that she was still processing everything. She had been betrayed before, and the thought of trusting someone again wasn't easy for her. But Holt knew one thing for sure. The Synthar were relentless, and time was running out. They had to make a choice. The room was quiet as Alaric finished speaking, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Holt and Kirill stood side by side, their expressions unreadable. Holt could feel the tension between them. Carol hadn't said a word since they entered the colony, and he knew she was still processing everything. But Holt couldn't afford to wait. The Xinthar were closing in, and he had to make a decision. Fast. Alaric's eyes didn't leave Holt's face, as if he was trying to gauge his reaction. "So, Captain, what's it going to be? Will you help us?" Holt kept his expression neutral. He didn't trust this man or his group, but he knew that if what Alaric said was true, they were running out of time. The Xinthar were relentless, and they weren't going to stop until they had the artifact. Holt had promised Carol he would protect her, and he wasn't about to break that promise now. "We don't make deals with strangers," Holt replied, his voice steady. "Not until we know exactly what you're offering." Alaric's smile didn't falter. "Fair enough, but you don't have the luxury of time, Captain. The Xinthar know where we are. They've already started their search for the artifact." Carol shifted beside Holt, her gaze still sharp but filled with uncertainty. She spoke quietly, but Holt could hear the weight of her words. "What if you're lying? What if you're just another group trying to get their hands on the artifact?" Alaric's eyes flickered, a brief moment of tension passing between them. "You don't trust anyone, do you?" he said, his voice almost amused. "I can understand that. But you need to realize, Carol, the artifact isn't just some weapon. It's a key to something much bigger, something that Xinthar will stop at nothing to control." Holt looked at Carol, sensing the conflict within her. He knew what she was thinking. She had been burned too many times before to just trust anyone. But the thought of the Xinthar gaining control of the artifact was something Holt couldn't ignore. "I'm not asking you to trust me completely," Alaric continued. "I'm offering you a chance to stop the Xinthar before they get what they want. If you come with us, we'll give you the information you need to stay ahead of them, and we'll protect the artifact for now." Holt thought for a moment, his mind working through the options. He didn't like the idea of being tied to this group, but he didn't have many choices. He had come here for answers, and Alaric was offering them. But the question still lingered. What was Alaric really after? "I'll help you," Holt said finally, his voice firm. "But know this, if you're lying, we won't hesitate to take the artifact and leave." Alaric nodded, his expression serious now. "Fair enough. We'll go to the central base. There, we can discuss the next steps." Without another word, Alaric led them out of the room and into the heart of the colony. The streets were quieter now, the earlier bustle replaced with an uneasy calm. Holt noticed several people watching them from doorways and windows, their eyes filled with suspicion. It wasn't hard to see that trust was in short supply here, and Carol's presence only made things worse. Everyone knew who she was and what she carried. As they walked, Holt kept his hand close to his weapon. He wasn't paranoid. He was just being cautious. If anything went wrong, he wasn't going to let Carol face it alone. They'd reached the central base within minutes, a small building at the edge of the settlement. It was fortified, with guards standing watch, their eyes trained on every movement. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. People moved quickly, but there was a sense of urgency in the air. Alaric led them to a small room at the back of the building. A large table was set up in the center, covered with maps, star charts, and various data pads. Alaric gestured for them to sit. "Let's get to work," Alaric said, his tone much more serious now. "We've been tracking the Xinthar's movements for months, and we know they're getting closer. But we can't do this without you, Captain. You're the only one who's been in the field, facing them head-on." Holt nodded, his mind already working through the possibilities. The Xinthar were dangerous, but they weren't invincible. He had fought them before, and he knew their tactics. But something was nagging at him. He had the feeling that Alaric wasn't telling them everything. There was more to this group, more to the artifact, and Holt was determined to find out what it was. Carol stood silently beside him, her arms crossed, watching Alaric closely. She hadn't said much since they arrived, but Holt knew she was just as suspicious as he was. The real fight was just beginning, and Holt couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap they hadn't seen yet. The room was filled with a quiet hum as Alaric began to outline the next steps. The data pads on the table flickered with maps, synthar movements, and notes on the artifact. Holt studied the screen, trying to make sense of it all, but something still didn't sit right. His gut told him there was more to the story than what Alaric was letting on. "So, what's the next move?" Holt asked, breaking the silence. Alaric stood beside the table, pointing at a map on the wall. "We know that Synthar are closing in on a facility here, on the planet Arius IV. It's an old mining colony, but there are hidden labs underneath. We believe the artifact is there, and the Synthar know it too. If they get their hands on it, they'll have control over everything." Kyrill's eyes narrowed as she looked at the map. She had been through too many false leads in the past to believe that this was the real deal. The artifact had been hidden for a reason, and every time someone came close to finding it, they ended up dead or betrayed. Holt could see the suspicion in her eyes. "And why do you think the artifact is there?" Kyrill asked, her voice calm but filled with doubt. Alaric hesitated, his gaze flickering to the others in the room. "We've been tracking a series of coded transmissions," he began. "They lead back to this location. The Synthar have been after it for a long time, and we believe they've already infiltrated the colony. We need to beat them there before they can unlock its secrets." Holt listened carefully, his mind working through the information. It made sense, in a way, but something still felt off. Alaric seemed too eager, too confident. Holt had been in enough dangerous situations to recognize when someone was hiding something. "All right," Holt said, standing up. "We'll go, but I want a full briefing before we leave. If we're going to walk into the lion's den, I need to know everything." Alaric nodded, but his eyes shifted nervously. "Of course. I'll gather the rest of the team. We leave as soon as possible." Kyrill shot Holt a glance. She was thinking the same thing he was. This mission wasn't going to be as simple as Alaric was making it sound. Holt could see the doubt in her eyes, but she said nothing. She trusted him, and he had promised to keep her safe, but this was starting to feel like a trap. They spent the next few hours preparing. The team Alaric had assembled was small, but they were skilled. Holt didn't trust them all, but he knew they didn't have much choice. The Synthar were too powerful to fight alone. As they loaded up into the transport, Holt couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The people in the colony had been too quiet, too distant. It was as if they knew something he didn't. Holt kept his hand close to his weapon, his senses sharp. Kyrill, too, seemed on edge. She kept looking over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to follow them. Holt knew she was afraid, but he also knew that fear could be a useful tool if you used it right. Once they were in the air, heading toward Arius IV, Alaric finally turned to them. "I didn't want to say this before," he began, his voice lower now. "But there's something else you need to know. The Synthar aren't the only ones after the artifact. There are others, humans, aliens, who want it too. Some of them will stop at nothing to get it, and not all of them are on our side." Holt's eyes narrowed. This was the information he had been waiting for. "Who else is involved?" he asked, his voice steady but demanding. Alaric looked around the room, making sure no one else was listening before he spoke again. "There's a faction, one that has infiltrated the highest levels of the rebellion. They've been working with the Synthar for months, feeding them intel on resistance movements. They want the artifact because of its power. They believe it can give them control over the galaxy." Kyrill's face went pale. "The rebellion? Betrayed?" she whispered. Alaric nodded. "Yes, and the worst part is, they know about you, Kyrill. They know what you carry. And they'll come for you the moment they get the chance." Holt felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The rebellion was supposed to be their ally, their last hope. But now, it seemed like they had been compromised from the inside. There were enemies everywhere, and trust was as dangerous as the Synthar themselves. Kyrill's hand clenched into a fist. Then we need to stop them. All of them. Holt turned to her, his voice firm. We will. But we need to be smart. That Xanthar and whoever else is after you, they'll be waiting for us. And we can't afford to make a mistake. As the transport made its way toward the surface of Irius IV, Holt looked out the window, his mind racing. He had promised to protect Kyrill, and now it seemed that every faction in the galaxy wanted to take her down. He wasn't sure how this would end, but one thing was certain. They were about to walk into the heart of danger. The transport descended toward Irius IV, the planet's surface barely visible through the thick clouds. Holt's eyes scanned the dark sky as the ship's engines rumbled. The cold, heavy feeling in his chest wouldn't go away. They were getting closer to the planet, and closer to the truth. He had no idea what to expect when they landed, but he knew they were walking into something much bigger than they had anticipated. Beside him, Kyrill sat silently, her face expressionless. Holt could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened around her seat. He didn't need to ask to know she was thinking about the betrayal Alaric had just mentioned, the one that had infected the rebellion, a traitor in their ranks, working with the Xanthar. Kyrill had trusted the rebellion. They were supposed to be the last hope. Now everything was in question. Captain Holt, Alaric's voice crackled over the comms, pulling him from his thoughts. We're almost there. I suggest you prepare yourselves. The facility we're heading to is heavily guarded. The Xanthar have already set up a perimeter. We need to move quickly. Holt glanced at Kyrill, who gave a brief nod. She was ready, as always. They had no choice but to move forward. With each passing second, the feeling of being trapped tightened around them. The transport landed smoothly in a clearing outside the mining facility. The moment the ramp lowered, Holt's senses went into overdrive. The air was thick with the smell of metal and dust, the distant hum of Xanthar energy shields buzzing in the background. Holt motioned for the team to stay low as they stepped out of the transport, weapons drawn and ready. The facility stood before them, a massive structure that looked abandoned at first glance. But Holt knew better. There was something off about the place. The Xanthar were never this easy to find. Alaric led them toward the entrance, his footsteps quick and confident. We'll enter through the rear. We have intel suggesting there's a hidden lab in the lower levels. That's where we'll find the artifact. Holt followed Alaric, his eyes scanning every corner. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Something wasn't right. They had to be cautious. As they moved through the darkened hallways, Holt noticed the silence. It was too quiet for a facility this size. There should have been workers or soldiers, but there was nothing. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the hall, followed by the shriek of alarms blaring. Holt's heart raced as the lights flickered and red emergency signals flashed overhead. It's a trap, Kyrill shouted, drawing her weapon. Holt was already moving, pulling Kyrill behind him as the first wave of Xanthar soldiers appeared from around the corner. They were fast, their weapons glowing with a deadly hum. But Holt was faster. He fired first, his shots landing with precision. The Xanthar soldiers dropped one by one. But as the last one fell, Holt realized something. Something was wrong. There was too much silence now, too much stillness. We're not alone, Kyrill muttered, her voice low. Holt turned to look at her, just as the sound of footsteps echoed from the shadows. They weren't Xanthar. The soldiers were human. A tall figure stepped out, his face hidden behind a helmet. He raised his weapon, and Holt's heart sank. "Welcome, Captain Holt," the figure said, his voice distorted through the mask. "I've been expecting you." Holt's grip on his weapon tightened, his mind racing. The voice was familiar, but he couldn't place it. And the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. "Who are you?" Holt demanded. The figure stepped forward, removing his helmet. Holt's breath caught in his throat as the face of the man beneath the mask was revealed. It was a face from his past, a face he had never wanted to see again. General Cade, Holt whispered. You. Cade had once been one of the most trusted officers in the rebellion, a man who had fought beside Holt during their early days. But something had changed. Holt hadn't seen him in years. He had thought Cade was dead, lost during an earlier battle. But now, here he was, standing in front of him, leading a group of soldiers that had clearly betrayed everything the rebellion had stood for. Surprised? Cade sneered, his eyes cold and unforgiving. You should be, Captain. It's a shame you never figured it out. All this time, I've been working with the Xenthar. And now, the artifact is mine. Holt's blood ran cold. The traitor was right in front of him, and he had been played all along. The artifact, the rebellion, and everything they had fought for. It was all part of Cade's plan to seize control. Kyrill's hand tightened on her weapon, her eyes burning with anger. You betrayed us all, she spat. Cade's lips curled into a cruel smile. I did more than that. I've been waiting for this moment. And now, you'll all see what true power looks like. Holt's heart pounded in his chest as Cade's soldiers surrounded them, weapons raised. The realization hit hard. General Cade, the man he had once called a brother in arms, was the mastermind behind everything. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound Holt had ever received. His mind raced, trying to figure out how to get them out of this situation alive. Kyrill stood close, her eyes never leaving Cade, her weapon still in hand. So this is your plan all along, Cade. Holt's voice was steady, but the anger was clear. You've been working with the Xenthar from the start. Cade's laugh echoed through the cold, metallic halls. Oh, it's more than that, Captain. The Xenthar and I are just the beginning. I've been setting up the perfect future, one where we control the galaxy, not the weak, pathetic rebellion. And now, the artifact will give me the final piece I need. Holt took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. You've sold us all out for power. You'll never get away with this. Cade raised his hand, signaling his soldiers to lower their weapons. You think I care about your rebellion? I've been waiting for this moment for years. The artifact is more than a weapon. It's a key to unlimited power. It will change everything, and I'll be the one to wield it. Kyrill's voice was low, full of disgust. You'll destroy everything we fought for. Everything you fought for. Cade sneered. I've been fighting for control since the beginning. The artifact will allow me to control not only the Xenthar, but any force in the galaxy. I'll rule everything, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Holt could see the madness in Cade's eyes, the same fire that had once burned in his own soul when they had fought side by side. But Cade had crossed a line. Holt knew they had to stop him. They had no other choice. You're wrong, Holt said quietly, his voice firm. You can't control the galaxy like this. You're only building your own destruction. Cade's eyes flashed with anger. You don't understand, Holt. Power isn't about control. It's about survival. The galaxy is a battlefield, and only the strong should survive. The weak will fall, and now that I have the artifact, nothing will stop me. Kyrill stepped forward, her gaze never leaving Cade. You're wrong. It's not about survival. It's about protecting what's worth saving. And you've lost that. Holt didn't waste any more time. With a swift motion, he reached for his weapon and fired at one of Cade's soldiers, taking him down in a single shot. Chaos erupted in the hallway as soldiers scrambled for cover, returning fire. Holt pushed Kyrill behind him, his gun steady as he shot at any threat that moved. Kyrill, Holt shouted over the noise. We need to get to the artifact before Cade does. Kyrill nodded, her face set with determination. Let's go. They fought their way down the narrow corridors, dodging blaster fire and moving fast. Holt's mind was on the artifact, on stopping Cade before it was too late. But as they moved, the weight of their situation sank in. They were deep inside enemy territory, surrounded by soldiers who would die to protect Cade. Every corner could hide another trap. Finally, They reached a large chamber deep inside the facility. At the center, on a raised platform, was a glowing pedestal, and resting on that pedestal was the artifact. But Cade and his remaining soldiers were already there. "You think you can stop me now?" Cade shouted, his voice filled with madness. He stepped forward, his hand reaching for the artifact. "This is the end for you, Holt." Holt raised his gun, but Carol stopped him with a hand on his arm. "We have to think this through," she said quietly. "Rushing in will only make it worse." Holt hesitated. She was right. They needed a plan. But as Cade moved closer to the artifact, it was clear that time was running out. "You're not taking it, Cade," Holt said, his voice full of resolve. Cade's eyes met his, and for a moment there was a flicker of hesitation, but it quickly vanished, replaced by cold determination. "You're too late." With a sudden motion, Cade activated the artifact. A burst of energy filled the room, and Holt felt the power in the air. It was like nothing he had ever experienced. The artifact wasn't just a key. It was a force that could reshape everything. But Holt wasn't about to let Cade use it. Not after everything that had happened. He raised his weapon once more. "Now, Carell," Holt shouted. In that moment, they both knew what had to be done. They had no choice. They had to stop Cade before he could unleash the artifact's power. This was the final stand. The final choice. The room erupted in a blinding flash of light as Cade activated the artifact. Holt's vision blurred for a split second, and a rush of energy filled the air, crackling like thunder. It was as if the entire facility had come alive, humming with power. Holt could feel the weight of it pressing against him. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a force of unimaginable strength. The artifact had the power to change everything, and Cade had his hands on it. They were running out of time. "Don't let him use it," Carell shouted, her voice filled with urgency. Without thinking, Holt lunged forward, his gun aimed at Cade. But the moment he moved, a blast of energy shot from the artifact, sending him stumbling backward. The force knocked the gun from his hand, and he crashed into the floor. Carell was quick to act, her agility allowing her to dodge another blast. She sprinted toward Holt, pulling him to his feet. "We need to stop him now," she said, her eyes filled with determination. Holt nodded, his body still aching from the blast. He could feel the power of the artifact, but he wasn't about to give up. Not now. They had come too far. Cade's laughter filled the room, echoing off the walls. "You really think you can stop me, Holt?" he taunted, raising his hand to unleash another blast. "You're too weak to understand what I can do with this power. You're nothing." But Holt didn't listen to Cade's words. He knew that Cade's confidence was his weakness. Holt had seen it before, the arrogance of a man who thought he was invincible. And Holt knew that arrogance always led to mistakes. In the chaos, Holt caught a glimpse of something, a control panel on the far side of the room, partially hidden behind a stack of crates. He didn't know what it controlled, but it was the only chance they had. "We need to get to that panel," Holt shouted, pointing toward the far corner. Carell didn't hesitate. "On it," she replied, already moving toward it. Holt turned his attention back to Cade. "You won't win," he said, his voice steady. "This ends now." Cade sneered, his hand crackling with energy. "You don't even realize it, do you? I've already won." But Carell was faster. She reached the control panel and began to work quickly, her hands moving over the buttons and switches with practiced speed. Holt kept his eyes on Cade, watching every movement, waiting for an opening. Suddenly, Cade's face twisted in anger. "No," he shouted, realizing too late what they were doing. He aimed the artifact directly at Carell, a powerful beam of energy shooting from it. Holt didn't think. He dove forward, pushing Carell out of the way just as the blast hit the spot where she had been standing. The impact sent him flying across the room, his body crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. Pain surged through him, but he fought to stay conscious. He could hear Cade's voice, filled with fury. as he moved toward the control panel, desperate to stop Carell. But Carell wasn't done yet. She quickly finished what she had started, slamming her fist down on the final button. The lights in the room flickered. The hum of the artifact began to fade, and the room grew silent. The power that had been so overwhelming suddenly began to lose its strength. "No," Cade screamed. "What have you done?" Carell stepped back, her face determined but strained. "I've just disabled the artifact's power core. It's useless now." Cade's eyes widened in disbelief. You think this is over? You can't stop me." But Holt, though weakened, struggled to his feet. He wasn't done. "It's over, Cade," he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "You've lost." Cade's eyes flickered with panic, but his arrogance still held him. He raised his hand again, preparing to fire. But before he could, Holt lunged forward, grabbing the nearest weapon and shooting Cade in the shoulder. The force of the shot sent Cade stumbling back, falling to the floor. The room was still. For a long moment, no one moved. Holt's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, his body aching from the battle. Carell stepped forward, looking at him with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it." Holt nodded, but his eyes were still on Cade. The man had once been a brother, but now he was nothing more than a fallen enemy. Holt knew there would be more battles ahead, but for now, they had won. The Xinthar were still out there. The rebellion still needed their help. But this was a victory, one that had come at a great cost. They had stopped Cade, and they had stopped the artifact from falling into the wrong hands. "We have to leave," Holt said, looking at Carell. "This place isn't safe." She nodded, her expression hardening with resolve. "Let's go." As they made their way out of the facility, Holt couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. There would be more fights, more betrayals. But together, they would face whatever came next.